So last video, I said this. Okay, so as we can see, history is a pretty complicated thing. We're going to spend the whole rest of this module talking about kind of how we got to where we are now, right? Where does history come from as a discipline, and how does it develop over time? That will be the purpose of Module 1. Oh, past Dr. Watkins, you looked so young, so youthful, so vibrant. If history is complex, then that means that it's done in lots of different ways. So in this video, we're going to explore the varieties of professional history. What are the many ways that historians study the past? We're going to talk a little bit about what distinguishes historians from each other. And then we're going to go into some depth explaining some of the big varieties, some of the main and most prominent varieties of history today. Okay, let's get going. Okay, first things first, what distinguishes historians from each other? Let's check it out. All right, remember way back when we talked about what history is? This was one of the slides I gave in that video, and I explained a few sort of features of history as a discipline. The one I want to remind you about, though, is that history is complex and continuous. Remember, what this means is that history is not done the same way. There's no such thing as one definitive history of anything, really. History is complex because it is about interpretation, and interpretations come from lots of different perspectives using lots of different things. History is also continuous, which means that the act of writing histories of particular times and places never ends. People continue to write histories again and again and again, revising narratives, adding to narratives, and making our understanding of the past more rich. But this begs the question, why? I mean, why is history so complex? Why do historians approach things so differently? Well, the best way to answer this question is to think about what distinguishes historians from each other. And this is a kind of simplification, but I think in many ways, the identity of a historian, how a historian sort of identifies herself or himself, is a sort of Venn diagram of what they study and how they study it. In other words, historians tend to define themselves by who they study in the past, what they study about the who they study, and why they study that thing. Let me give you perhaps an example of this. You might be a historian who studies farmers in medieval Japan. That's the who. But you might also look specifically not just at farmers, but how farmers got into conflicts with the government of Japan. That's the what. And then finally, you might study farmers and their conflicts with the government in Japan in order to understand the question about revolts and the way that they helped to establish or strengthen imperial power and authority in medieval Japan. The kind of trifecta of these things helps to identify what type of historian you are. Let me give you maybe another example. We could approach this from the way that people approach sources. So let's take a really kind of silly example. Let's say that historians in 100 years find my diary. Well, what might they do with that diary? Totally depends on the historian. For example, one historian might look at this as a way to study, well, me, right? Or study me, an example of a professor. And maybe they would search the diary and see that I talk a lot about soccer in my diary because it's something I really like. So that would be the what of what they're interested in. And then finally, they might use my diary to understand me, my perspectives about soccer, in order to understand sort of the question of how sports influenced, like, I don't know, intellectuals or professors in 21st century America. Or other historians could use my diary in other ways. For example, they might use my diary to understand my wife and not me. They might find out that my wife is a teacher, and they might use that to try to understand how teachers did their work. They might use my diary as a great primary source into how women impacted the educational sphere in 21st century Texas. Okay, so all of these histories could be written using this one primary source. So what changes the history is the historian, who the historian is, and what she or he is interested in knowing about the past. Now I want to take a look at some of the main varieties of history. We're not going to cover every single variety of history because there are way too many, but we can focus in and explore a little bit about some of the biggest ones, some of the main varieties that historians practice today. Okay, so we know that historians approach the past in lots of different ways. This is kind of the foundation of what we might think of as the varieties of history, the many kinds of ways that historians approach the past. Jeremy Popkin, the author of the book that you're reading, has this quote that you read that helps to sort of explain what the varieties of history are. He says, all historians study the past, but different historians are interested in different aspects of human behavior. Like different species of animals, historians employing different approaches tend to herd together and separate themselves from other scholars. What he's describing here is that that history is complex, that the historians study the past in different ways, but also that in so doing, oftentimes they kind of congregate together into groups of sort of like-minded historians looking at like-minded things. This is what the variety of history is. There are lots of varieties of history. We can't get into all of them. But in this class, I want us to focus particularly on 5. We're going to call these the big 5 varieties of history. The first is political history. In many ways, this is one of the oldest varieties of history. Political history is basically just the history of political leaders, political events, political movements, political groups, and more generally, systems of power. The second is military history. This one's probably fairly intuitive. Military history is essentially the history of wars, conflicts, and the people that fight them and are affected by them. The third one we're going to look at is social history. Social history is the history of ordinary people, ordinary daily life. And we can pull a piece of a quote from George Trevelyan, who says it's the history of people with the politics left out. In other words, social history is often defined as a kind of antithesis to political history, or sort of the other side of the story. Fourth, cultural history. Cultural history can be a little confusing, but ultimately cultural history is the history of meaning and how it's constructed and shared and contested. The final one we're going to look at is women's history. Women's history is a part of all of the rest of these histories in many ways, right? It overlaps with lots of other histories. But as we'll see, women's history also kind of develops as its own variety, its own individual field, all the way back from the pre-modern period. Women's history, very simply, is just the history of women, their positions in society, politics, and patriarchal structures. And the main thing to understand about women's history is that women's history is often a sort of revisionist history, meaning it's often written as a reaction to other dominant normative histories that exist at the time. These are only 5 of the varieties of history. There are, in fact, many, many more. And I'm not going to go into super depth here, but I just want to show you kind of a scattershot of the many varieties of history that exist in the professional historical profession. Many of these are kind of offshoots or related to some of the big 5 that we just talked about. For example, much like political history, there are other types of history that are sort of similar but go in slightly different directions, like diplomatic history, which is the history of diplomacy and foreign relations, or legal history, which is the history of laws and how they develop and change over time. Or post-colonial history, which is sort of political history, but from the perspective of not those in power, but those who are often the victims of power structures. We can also look at some offshoots or some varieties that are connected to social history. Economic history is a branch of, or a variety of history that's really similar to social history, looking at the economy and how the economy affects people. There's also lots of particular social histories of particular groups. African American history, Asian American history, Latinx history, LGBTQ history, the history of labor, right, and of working class communities, Native American history. All of these are sort of offshoots of social history, understanding the histories of particular groups in societies. We can also think about microhistory. That's a history of very, very small events or very, very small communities. And then there's the history of different types of members of society, like the history of children or the history of families. And the list goes on. If we think about cultural history, that can make us think of lots of other varieties of history that are really similar to that are also looking at meaning in slightly different ways. For example, religious history is the history of religion and its impact on societies, the way that religion has shaped communities and provided meaning for communities over time. Intellectual history is the history of ideas, of mentalities, of what people think and how they think that and why. The history of science is the history of scientific development, the history of technology, the history of how people have adopted scientific methods and scientific principles over time. Gender history is the history of meaning and identity, specifically through the lens of gender, how gender has affected and shaped societies in the past. Environmental history is its own sort of thing. It's the history of how humans have interacted with their environments and how their environments have impacted human societies. And the list goes on and on. So there are countless varieties of history that we could look at and that have developed over time. And perhaps a good way of thinking about the differences here of all these varieties of history is to go back to an example again. What would historians from all these varieties of history do if faced with the same question? And here I'm going to take a Twitter thread started by Professor Kathleen Belew from Northwestern University. She asked on Twitter, what if we took the example of why did the chicken cross the road? So here's what Dr. Belew said. Political history, sort of old school, would offer a biography of what made this a great chicken. New school political history would be interested in the authority of the chicken, right? The power structures of the chicken crossing the road and whether that chicken was permitted and also the state's relationship to both the chicken and the road. Diplomatic history wants to know where the road goes and who lives on the other side. Social history wants to know not about the chicken that crossed the road, but the chickens that lived in the community that gave rise to the chicken that crossed the road, such that we can better understand how the crossing was a collective action. And she goes on. Military history wants to know how the road was crossed, what obstacles were encountered, and whether the chicken was successful. Intellectual history wants to know about the idea of the road, how we know it's a road, what the boundaries previous roads have looked like, and whether this one really was crossed at all. And then other people started jumping in. Dr. Catherine French said historians of women would want to know if the chicken was female and if crossing the road was because of her own agency or a burden imposed because of patriarchal structures. Another person, Austin Clements, said economic history assumes the chicken crossed the road as a rational choice motivated by its desire for material gain, that is, corn pellets. And even more, historians of gender will want to know about the gender constructs in chicken society. Is road crossing coded as a gender-specific activity? In crossing this road, is the chicken defying or conforming to gender norms? How might the crossing have reshaped those norms? Who benefits? And then finally, microhistory, which I briefly mentioned before, deeply examines one account of one chicken who crossed a road once to understand the broader phenomenon. Not because this case is typical, but because the extraordinary depth of evidence provides a yardstick for more fragmentary cases. So this is a silly exercise, but it helps to illustrate that there are lots of varieties of history, and these varieties differ depending on what historians focus on and the kinds of questions they ask, what they are seeking to know from their study of those people and those things. Okay, so what have we learned? Well, first and foremost, we've learned that since history is complex, that means that it's done in lots of different ways. The varieties of history are some of the manifestations of ways that historians approach the past, the things that they look at, the ways that they study those things, and how that differentiates historians from each other. This is the beginning of what we'll call historiography. Second, we looked a little at some of the main varieties that are practiced by professional historians today. These ones will be really important for you going forward because they're the ones that we're going to kind of focus on for the rest of this module. All of them kind of can trace their histories all the way back to the pre-modern period. In one form or another, these 5 varieties of history have sort of existed as a kind of undercurrent of historical writing for a long, long time. Finally, the thing to know about all of these varieties of history is that they've changed over time. They haven't existed the way that they exist today for thousands of years. In fact, they come from certain places. They've developed and changed and transformed over time into what they are now. So this video was really about establishing what the varieties of history look like right now. For the rest of the module, we're going to look at how they got to be that way, where they came from, who was involved in changing them and developing them, and why they changed. Okay, that's it for this video. I hope you're taking notes. Make sure to bring those notes to class with you, and I'll see you then.